Welcome to Under the Radar, a show about independent iOS app development. I'm Marco Arment.
And I'm David Smith. Under the Radar is never longer than 30 minutes, so let's get started. So today we wanted to talk about something that is relevant for this time of year insofar as coming out of WWDC, looking forward to this fall when all of these new technologies, all these new platforms are suddenly going to be released. This is usually a good time to think about building something new, to build a new app, to explore something, whatever that may be. And the first step in starting a project like that, in diving into building something, is, of course, coming up with the idea for what that thing is. Ideas are a funny thing. I think a lot of people put a bit too much weight on ideas, that you can kind of, it's like you have the concept of like, oh yeah, I'm just the idea guy, kind of a mindset like that the idea in and of itself is an important and valuable thing. And while the idea is useful and an essential part of building something, by and large, the idea for exactly what you actually are doing is less important. And what you need to do, though, is whenever you have an idea, you have, I think, a thought of, I'm going to do this. I'm going to build an app that does X. At least I found it's important to have a way to look at that and say, is this worth doing? How can I characterize this idea and understand if it's worth pursuing? And partly what I think we're going to unpack today is about years ago, I did an episode of my previous podcast, Developing Perspective, where I kind of unpacked this, and I came up with a framework there that I think is a helpful way to think about this, and I think it's still very relevant, and so hopefully we can kind of update the ideas in it. But essentially, when I think about ideas, it's to understand that, like, conceptually, an idea is either easy or hard, in terms of to implement. Like, you have this concept of, I want it to do something. Is that a trivial thing to do, or is it a really hard thing to do? And then some ideas have a very high reward potential, and some ideas have a very low reward potential. And so you end up when now we have two axes and these sort of mutually exclusive directions. And so you have the perfect, like business journal concept of, like, now we have 4 quadrants, and we can think about our idea in those 4 quadrants. Because there's some interesting characteristics of taking an idea and thinking of it in that way. Like, is this easy, high reward? Is this easy, low reward? Hard, low reward, or hard, high reward? And if you can't think of an idea through that way, you're going to potentially struggle to know if it's a good idea to pursue. So before we dive into that, though, I was curious if, Marco, if you have ever, when you have an idea to start something, like when you were thinking of building Overcast, or when you were thinking of building Instapaper or the magazine, or any of your sort of the products that you ultimately went on to build, when you had the idea, did you think concretely about it before you started, or did you just get started?
At that time, for almost everything I've done, I've just gotten started on it. It's only been fairly recent in my life and career that I've started actually trying to evaluate these things in a more objective and honest way before I just dive in and devote months or years to doing them. Because it's, evaluating your own ideas is really hard. And especially for people like us who like to build things and who get pleasure out of building things, it is so easy and so tempting to just jump in and start doing it. And often that works out well for a lot of people. But there's also a lot of times where it doesn't, because fundamentally there was some kind of disagreement between how valuable the idea was in your head and how valuable the market decides that it is once you put it out there. And it's, I don't know if you can really develop that skill to be able to evaluate your idea early. And that's part of the justification for doing like a minimum viable product early, where, like, rather than having some grand idea that you think about for years and you just are waiting for someone to come along and, I don't know, pay you $1 million for your idea or something, which never happens, by the way. And I can do a quick diversion right now on the value of ideas by themselves. And basically, any app developer, most of our audience has probably been pitched somebody's terrible idea before, and they're like, "Oh, I have this great idea. It's a secret, though. You got to promise not to steal it." Or they'll actually sometimes they'll make you sign an NDA before they'll tell you their idea, or they will have patented their idea, or they will think they are patenting their idea, even though they've only maybe just applied for one or are thinking about applying for one. And all of these common failings reflect an overvaluation of ideas by a lot of people. And the reality is, these days, when people ask me to, sign an NDA or agree to keep their idea secret before they tell me their idea, I just say no thanks. Just because what has happened over the last, 10 years that people have been pitching me their terrible ideas, is I have literally never heard an idea from somebody that was worth agreeing to any kind of terms to hear the idea. It has never happened, not a single time. And the main problem people have is the reason why their idea doesn't exist, or that it doesn't exist and they just haven't heard of the product, is so often because it's a bad idea, or because it's impossible, or because the market doesn't care. And or the more likely case is that these things do exist and they just didn't notice, or they didn't find the one that existed, or it did exist but it failed and it went away, and that's also something worth knowing. So the actual value of the raw idea, it is very, very hard for people to honestly get that. So as I was saying earlier, there is some value in trying to get something out there quickly in a minimal way that will let the market then tell you whether your idea is good or not. But a lot of times that just isn't possible, or the barrier between zero and minimum viable product is just too high to be able to take a big risk on before you have some idea of how good an idea is. So you do have to, at some point, develop the skill of evaluating whether your idea is actually worth doing or not. And I mean, the easiest way to do that is to just look at the market, look at similar things, because I mean, if nothing has ever been done like that before, again, chances are you're just not finding it. But if truly nothing has ever been done like that before, try to find something that's at least close, or at least similar in some way. Find some kind of guidance in the market already to see what might the reward for this actually be, and be honest with yourself about that too. I mean, you're probably the master of this because you have released so many apps. You have more experience than anybody I know in putting out an idea and seeing how it does in the market. I mean, how do you address this?
So I think the thing that I've come to learn over the years of shipping lots and lots and lots of apps is the degree to which, while that the idea itself doesn't really matter ultimately. And by that I mean, there are many very successful apps in the App Store that don't do anything novel. At least ostensibly, they are a to-do list app, they are a weather app. I've made a weather app, which is one of the most kind of absurd things to do in many ways, because all I had, it's I'm going into a category where there's an actual top level category in the App Store saying this is a category of apps. There isn't a to-do list category. They all have to get shoehorned into utilities. But with weather apps, there is an actual place in the App Store that says here's all of the weather apps, with the implication that there are a lot of them. And there are. And they're all displaying what is functionally the same thing. They're just displaying it in a different way. And so why did I make a weather app? And it's the idea I had for Check the Weather, the app I'm talking about, was a very basic kind of concept of I wanted to be able to swipe left and right to see the hourly view and the daily view, and swipe up to get a radar view. That was the only sort of concept that I had before I started, which as if that's all I have as my idea, is a pretty weak thing. That's not something that you would imagine is going to set the world on fire. And it's so easy to have and I run into this sometimes with people who get frustrated with, they say, oh, I wish I was indie, I just don't have a good idea. You don't really need an idea so much as you just need the willingness to build something. And then and this is where it gets a bit awkward sometimes from a developer's perspective, is you have to work out not so much if your idea is valuable, so much as can you sell whatever it is you're building? At the end of the day, is there enough that's slightly different in whatever it is you're building that is going to get people's attention and have a little hook? because that's ultimately more what you're selling probably than the idea. Like, if you really did come up with a truly revolutionary novel idea that no one has ever thought of or imagined before, like, wow, that's awesome. Like, good on you. You know, you deserve your accolades, your Nobel Prize. Like, that's great. But more likely than not, if you're making an app for the App Store, it's not that. Like, the things that are these weird, out of the blue runaway successes tend to be more like random. Like, I almost imagine like the idea for Flappy Bird, right? Like, I doubt the developer for that sat down and said, oh, I have this great genius idea, like this bird that jumps up and down and then runs into pipes. And like, this is going to be it. And like, it turned out that was huge. I don't think you could have characterized that as it being huge ahead of time. And so, while I think there's some amount of being able to think about it, it's so important as a developer to focus on the thing that is going to be important isn't so much the idea. Like, you can have the worst idea, but, you know, geniusly implemented and be more successful than the best idea poorly implemented. And so when I go through and I'm thinking about what do I, you know, do I want to build something? It's usually either, you know, is this something that I like? It's you know, it scratches my own itch, which is usually a great place to start for an idea that you have. Like, rather than trying to imagine a concept that's like far off somewhere, that like I think people who do this activity that I'm not really related to or, you know, think about will do, and trying to like project yourself into that to make something. It's like, make something that makes sense to you. Think about the ideas that you have for products or things that are close and relevant to you, that scratch an inch, that like are doing something in a way that you want, because at the very least you'll understand it. And then once you have those types of ideas, like, you just like build it. And, you know, this is certainly like, you call it a minimal viable product, or you could just call it like not getting too stuck in the weeds. But a lot of the way that I've ended up building things is I worry a lot less about if it's a good idea. And maybe a better question is you know, could I make a good version of whatever it is I'm building? Like, I have a lot of ideas for games, for example. Like, I have a big, in my OmniFocus list, I have this big list of things that anytime I have an app idea, I put it in there. And I've been doing this for years. And there's a lot of junk in there. There's a few things that went on subsequently, like other people sort of implemented the idea that I had and were successful with it, which is always kind of a funny feeling. And I think that is where a lot of people's kind of secretiveness about things or things can come from, that feeling of like, oh man, someone else did what I, you know, did my idea. It's like, well, that's simultaneous invention. This is just the way it always happens.
Yeah, all the time.
All the time. Like, you're not as special as you think you are when you have your novel idea. But mostly, like, I look at it like, I have great ideas for games, but I don't know how to build a game, and I don't really want to learn how to do that. And I don't think that would be a constructive use of my time. And so I don't build those things, and that's okay. Like, those are potentially good ideas, but I would have terrible execution for them. So there's no point in me pursuing those ideas. When it makes sense for me to do, and this is the advice I usually give when people are kind of asking me these types of questions. It's like, what do you think you could make a good version of? Like, what are you an expert in? What is a topic that you know more about than most other people? And there may not be a business case or a market there, which would be unfortunate. Like, ideally, you have this great expertise in an area that is relevant to a lot of people. But either way, that's a great place to start. When you think about, you know, is this idea, like, could I build a good version of this? Like, do you understand it? Could you, you know, do you use it a lot? Like, I imagine part of why you made Overcast is because you listen to a lot of podcasts. And so you have a lot of opinions. You have a lot of ideas that are not the big idea. And maybe that's sort of ultimately where I'm heading with this line of thought is the big idea, like the thing that you would like pitch somebody, it's like Uber but for dogs, like that version of the idea where you're trying to like boil it down. That's not the important part. Like, the important part is the teeny little details that you're going to will go into actually building that product that will make it a success or a failure. Like, those are the parts, the little choices that you're going to make, which you probably aren't even thinking about when you start off with like the grand idea. And so the quicker that you can get to a point that you can say, like, do I have a good ideas way down at that basic tactical level for what am I doing that's different or interesting? Which problem am I actually solving? Like, that's where the really interesting work will happen. And the sooner you can get to there, the better.
Exactly. There's so much like fretting and focusing and anxiety about people's ideas, but it really does not, like, the idea matters so little, or in many cases is so impossible to actually do. Like, just doing something boring well is way more valuable in general than doing some crazy awesome idea. And a little tip here: if your idea begins with "it's like X but for Y," if X is something worth $1 billion or more, just don't even do that idea, because people will just, like, that means that thing is so big that Y people will just use X for that thing. It's just not worth it. Also, there's also like significant scale issues of, like, saying something like your example. It's like Uber for dogs. Like, do you know how much is involved in starting a company like Uber? It's like there's like immense scale here that it's so much easier to do things that are within the scope of what one person or a very small company can do. And so many ideas are based on what you see, like, in the consumer web and the consumer app world. But those companies built themselves up to that over years, and usually with millions and millions of dollars in funding, and with very large staffs, and also with a lot of luck and timing that you probably won't have. So it's important to contextualize your ideas too, like, just in time and in scale. Like, you can't build a new Facebook today because Facebook is Facebook, and Facebook built Facebook 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Like, it's a different time now. And so whatever the big idea is going to be that you can start as one person today is not probably going to resemble a $1 billion+ company that exists already today. Let me take a quick break here and talk about our sponsor this week. It's Braintree. Braintree makes payments and your job a whole lot easier. So why make payment integration more difficult than it has to be? Braintree's powerful full-stack payment platform allows you to accept nearly any type of payment from any device with just one integration. It's flexible to your system's needs and supports most programming languages. So whether you're using Java, Ruby, or Python, you'll always have a range of server-side and client-side SDKs available. The Braintree code supports Android, iOS, and JavaScript clients, and it takes just 10 lines of code to implement. Braintree makes payments and your job a whole lot easier. Learn more at BraintreePayments.com/radar. That is BraintreePayments.com/radar. Thanks a lot to Braintree for supporting Under the Radar and all of Relay FM. Now, I wanted to talk about something that has bitten me before and that I think a lot of people don't think about, which is, so, we just finished talking about how you should, keep in mind your scale as one person, or as maybe you have a partner or two trying to make an app with you, but chances are you're like between 1 and 3 people, and you might also be doing this part-time while you still work a full-time job to pay the bills. So the scale of what you can do is, of course, limited compared to what somebody like Facebook could do, for example. And you mentioned earlier, like how you have ideas for games, and I do too, and I don't make the games that I have ideas for most of the same reasons you don't make the games you have ideas for, that we don't know how to make games. In my case, I barely even play games, and I might have an idea for a decent game that sounds like a good idea, but there's a very big difference between the idea and being able to make a fun game, and then being able to make a fun game that's successful. And one of the problems, even if you are one of the lucky few who can make a fun, successful game, a lot of times the people who do this are bitten by a failure to plan ahead for what happens next, or at least they're surprised by what happens next in a bad way. When you're planning an app, when you're thinking of an idea, when you're choosing what to do, also consider the end game. How does this story end if you succeed? Right? Because you're probably focused on getting from the present day to the launch day. And what can you possibly do to make this thing succeed, or to make this thing good, or to make people like this thing? But then think about, too, what happens if you do succeed? Does that put you in a place that you want to be? And does this put you in a business that you want to operate? So, for example, you launch some kind of big game based on, or some kind of fun game based on a really good idea that you had. What happens in the App Store to good ideas?
They get copied, I think.
They get copied quickly and brutally and thoroughly and shamelessly copied. I mean, the degree of copying the App Store, especially in games, is just brutal. What happens if you have this great idea for a game? You can put it out there. You can even try to patent it or trademark it and try to protect it on some level, but your protections won't really work in the grand scheme of things. And what if you have a good idea? If your idea succeeds at all, it'll be copied immediately. So what would you do? If you release this thing, like, are you planning for that? Are you aware that this is going to happen? Are you okay with that happening? What happens if it does happen? Can your business survive? Will your projections about what this might bring in be changed if somebody else comes out with the same thing for free? If you're charging something for yours, or if theirs just succeeds more. You can look at things like Threes and 2048, and like there's so many examples of this where like a big game comes out, but then somebody else comes out, or many people come out with like a free version that is similar, even if it isn't exactly the same. It could just be similar, and then that version gets way more attention because it was free, or because it just caught on better, or something else. So you have to plan for the immediate future of your app, of like what happens a month later, 2 months later, a year later. And you also have to plan for what happens if this succeeds on an ongoing basis. Then what kind of business am I in, and what kind of involvement does that require? What kind of overhead does that require? And is that something I want to do? And this is something I failed at in the past with the magazine in particular, where I was so focused on building the app, building the magazine's app, and building like the technical side of it and the reading experience, that I really didn't put enough thought into what happens if this succeeds. Then I have to put out a magazine issue every 2 weeks forever. Like, that's a lot of work. I have to be an editor. I have to deal with writers. I have to deal with people's pitches, and I have to deal with payments and processing and editing and rights management and so much stuff. And it's like, that's a lot of work, and I have no experience doing that. And do I really want to be obligated every 2 weeks to be putting out like a big block of content? And the answer, of course, was no. This similarly happened to me on a much shorter but more intense time scale with Peace, my ad blocker from last summer, which is, I released this app thinking that it would kind of fly under the radar, ding, and thinking that it would kind of, be a moderate success, maybe, maybe have a few tens of thousands of users at most, which would be a great success for most apps, and that would be it. And I would just kind of, let it kind of run and put it in low maintenance mode and forget about it, because it wouldn't need much maintenance, allegedly. And I found out very quickly, first of all, that Peace succeeded beyond my wildest expectations. It shot up to the top of the charts, and it was bringing in good money, but it was also bringing in a lot of negative attention and exposure to possible lawsuits and reputation damage and all sorts of problems that it was bringing with me, because it turns out the ad blocking business is just really messy. And however you fall on the politics of that, it is a messy business to be in. And I didn't quite foresee that or think about that enough before I did it. And it turned out I hated being in that position. It was like really, really ruining things for me in a lot of ways. Just mostly like I just couldn't take the stress of it, and it was a bad scene. So I hadn't properly thought through, like, is this the business I really want to be in if this succeeds? And I now, as I think about current and future projects that I do now, I think a lot more about that also, which is like, so for so much of my career, I was worried about what happened, how would this thing fail, and why would it fail, and can I prevent it from failing? But you also have to think about, if it succeeds, is that even where you want to go?
Yeah, and I think there's so much of this too. There's this. I definitely run into this too, and in many ways, this is a problem that I deal. I deal with it from. I have a similar problem, but from a different direction. Where I like the thing that I don't take into account typically is that if I build a product and I put it out in the store, people are going to expect it to be updated and
supported.
And like that's a perfectly reasonable thing. And I a couple of years ago, I started to realize that like I've gone through this pattern of I have an idea, I built it, I put it into the App Store so many times that the number of apps and things that I am responsible for is just too much. Like it's kind of mind bending. That's like sometimes I'll get a customer support email for an app, and I'm like, what app is this? Like, what did I build this? Like
even I forgot about this.
Like, and that's not good, right? Like this is. But I definitely ran into that same problem, and so as a result, I am much more careful about committing to a project and heading down that road than I used to be. Like I can imagine, like past me would have looked at this fall and been like, oh man, look at all this crazy stuff we can do in messaging. Like I need to have like 10 sticker packs on day one. I need to have any kind of thing I could ever possibly imagine for iMessage. Like just throw all the spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. And maybe that sort of works. Like there's something to it. It's a viable way to sort of test out a market in some ways, but the difficulty is making sure that you're comfortable with what that looks like if more things stick than you actually are thinking will stick, and being sure that you're, like you're saying, getting into businesses that you like, because I think this is such an easy thing to, like, it's so easy to underestimate the difficulty of success. Because it's so easy to just think of success as it's the dancing in the meadow with, it's like, it's great. Right. Everything this is exactly what I wanted. Like it's popular, it's well respected, it's bringing in money. Like what could be wrong? It's like, well, depending on why it's succeeding, or what it is, or the amount of time and effort that it took for it to succeed, you may not actually like that. Like I think I had the idea when a while back that I wanted to. It's like, you know what? I think I could make a really cool feed reader. This was even before Google Reader announced that they were going to close, and then started working on it, and then Google Reader announced that they're going to close, and I was like, great, this is perfect. Like I've been working on this project, and now there's this great marketing opportunity, so I went for it, and like I made Feed Wrangler. And while I wouldn't say that I regret making Feed Wrangler, and it's still ongoing to this day, like it's been a successful product for me, there was a period where I had no idea what it would mean to actually like have a web service that's, at any appreciable scale. And so I spent the better part of, a few months, like hardly sleeping, hardly seeing my family, like constantly dealing with server fires and scaling issues. And like, that's great insofar as like, I released it and people liked it. And so it was successful, but I wasn't prepared for that success. And so in many ways, that was probably not a great idea. And I think, ultimately, a lot of these things kind of, in my mind, they feed back into this part of me it's like the classic, like fear of missing out kind of a mindset, where when I think of, say, even Feed Wrangler, like at the time, I had such this anxiety about, well, I have the ability to do this, and I could do it. And if I don't, like someone else will, and they may be really successful. And like the fear of missing that opportunity clouded my judgment as to what I was actually getting involved in. And I think that is a pattern that happens more often than we wished it did, where it's easy to focus on like somebody this fall is going to make a sticker pack that's going to make thousands of dollars. Almost certainly. Like, just look at the top paid list in the App Store, and kind of it blows my mind a little bit. Like the things that are making lots of money in the App Store these days. Like the App Store is a weird place, but that's a topic for another day. But just because that's maybe true, it doesn't mean that I want to get into that business and be chasing whatever is going to be successful there. I need to be comfortable saying, you know what, I'm going to miss out. I'm going to choose to miss out on that potential opportunity and focus on something, a business that I want to be in, a business that I think isn't just a good idea, but is an idea that I want to live with going forward, and can see myself being in this industry, being in the bit, like right now I make health and fitness apps, and I love making health and fitness apps. Like that's my focus. And I can see being in that focus forever, because it's rewarding, it's fun, it's personal. It's great. And like, that's the way that I kind of look at these ideas and say, are they worth doing? Can I live with it, for the rest of my life, ostensibly, or at least for the rest of my career?
And that's what I didn't do with Peace. And now I've learned.
There you go. It's a learning experience.
All right. We're out of time this week. Thanks for listening, everybody. And we will talk to you next week.
Bye.